In this topic, we're looking at networks and social political uprisings, the relationship between movements and media, in other words. And starting off, I think it's worth keeping a note of the historical dimension to activist movements, to digital activism. And Yang Guobin makes this point very clearly, where he says that we should recognize that digital activism has histories, that is produced a product rather of historical conditioning in specific contexts. By the way, it's interesting to follow up, perhaps for some of you, on the link here, which I'll provide in the notes as well, for a really interesting conference in 2014 on digital activism that was held at King's College in London. So, in thinking then of the history of social political movements in the 60s and 70s, think of the feminist movements, the global reach of these movements, the civil rights movements, which was particularly powerful in the United States, peace and anti-war movements, anti-nuclear movements as well. These were global, very big. Student movements, May 68, France, the alignment between students and workers is also happening in the United States and to a lesser extent elsewhere around the world. The environmental movements, very important at the time, still of course are today with Greenpeace, the anti-nuclear movement there too. And across these different movements, media has always played a really strong role. Think of the use of slogans, graffiti, pamphlets, Theatre 8, Super 8 films. There have been very creative uses of media and examples of users taking control of media to produce their own messages, which then keep movements going, keep them strong, galvanize them, and allow themselves to be understood both internally and externally. So here are some examples from student movements in '68, very sort of wonderful, beautiful designs, I think. Classic sort of image here, the student movements in France in '68. Again, see some more student movement photographs here. Very theatrical. It's also very sort of simple graphics, simple messages, but powerful ones. If you think of the sort of slogans and messages we see coming out of the Occupy movement these days, the 1% versus 99%, very strong slogan again, and communicated really effectively. It's also, worth keeping in mind that technology has defined many of the pro-democracy revolutions over time in really particular ways. 1989 was the year of the fax machine and the student movements in China. 2001 was famous for the mobile phone and texting to organize protests against the Philippines President Estrada. 2009-10, Twitter, social political uprisings in Iran in response to presidential elections. 2010-11, more recently of course, we've got Facebook and Twitter being used across the Arab Spring. 2011 again, Facebook, Twitter, Tumblr, these were key social media in Occupy Wall Street. So in a number of these cases, governments seek to block access to internet communications, and movements have sought ways around this by using peer-to-peer proxy servers. More recently in Hong Kong, we've indeed seen off-the-grid computing through the use of Bluetooth social media networks being developed in order to continue organisation when internet signals are not easy to access. WikiLeaks, through these more recent revolutionary movements, was often seen as a catalyst in inspiration for many. And Anonymous, you may have heard of Anonymous, provided much of the technical support and internet attacks on government websites when social media sites became blocked in the Middle East. So, we could ask, do the sum of these movements indicate new forms of sociality and contests of power, network sociality and network power? In thinking about these sort of questions, it's worth locating some theoretical concepts that we might use to help us unpack some of the qualities specific to these movements. And at a technical level, we can speak about a shift from mass audiences associated with the process model of communication, which I introduced earlier, to networked users due to the sort of technological transformation that we see from what Manuel Castells, sociologist of networked media, calls the space of places to the space of flows. So here we begin to see that communication is no longer just one-to-many, but can be one-to-one, one-to-many, many-to-many. In other words, it's a peer-to-peer, distributed, decentralized, networked form of communication going on. This network logic is based on what Felix Stalder calls network flexibility, which makes it attractive, of course, for businesses and military, but also to individuals and civilian populations, where networks are better able to deal with complexity and unpredictability because they're more fluid forms of organization and communication. Think of the rise of flash mobs. Nowadays, perhaps a marketing gimmick, but at the time, kind of a powerful technique of tactical media and social movements. And these all come to bear around technologies of speed and convergence. In the case of the Arab Spring, the role of Al Jazeera, broadcast media outlet, was very important in mobilizing the Egyptian street. In some respects, in others, critics will say that it was in fact quite minimal. Of course, we've got a highly regulated state media that gives rise to new forms of expression and organisation using internet communications and social media. And there have been long simmering and social and political frustrations, and these catalysed the possibilities of organisation that were afforded by social media technologies, as distinct from the sort of reporting, mobilisation that broadcast media outlets such as Al Jazeera were able to offer. Interesting here to see the sort of design of one of the posters going on here in English, of course, but it sort of harks back to some of that sort of 60s social movement design that we saw in one of the earlier slides. The classic feature of populations massing around town squares and centres, and signalling both social media of Facebook, but also Twitter. Hashtag Jan25 was a key Twitter hashtag used to, organize, aggregate kind of messages around the movements. There's also been an amazing amount of scholarship produced and fantastic documentation and resources that you can find to help kind of understand how the media was being used in the Middle East during the uprisings there. One of these studies we begin to see here the percentage of people who spent time doing the following activities. Watching TV was pretty high, listening to radio, not so high, reading a newspaper, 54% there, reading a magazine, 32%, reading a book, not so high either. This is average, by the way. And then you get to see different countries with different colours and the specific percentages being attributed there. Use of internet, 66%, okay? So not an enormously high use of internet as well. So probably a lot of the communication organisation was happening offline. In terms of the most popular social media that we're seeing in some of these studies and results, perhaps no surprise maybe that Facebook was a really crucial form of social media. LinkedIn, by comparison, not so great at all. Twitter, 52%. Okay, I thought it could have been a bit higher than that, but it's overwhelmingly a sort of Arab Spring media of Facebook. The Guardian newspaper in Britain produced some fantastic analysis and documentation of the Arab Spring as well. Got this great timeline that you can access there and go back and see different sort of events going on at the time, and associate that with political movements, regime change, and the international response. So it's worth having a look as well. A really detailed study that they've prepared there for interactive use. So some provisional conclusions we could say about networked media and social political uprisings and movements. So networked communication and media provide a means of political organisation and mobilisation of the masses. It's not as easy with broadcast media, that's for sure. Why? Well, because remember, again, we're talking about networked, peer-to-peer driven models of communication where users are able to produce content. They're not waiting around subject to the whimsies of big broadcast media. That said, a symbiotic relationship often exists between these two forms. So networks provide the content for broadcast media, which are often able to disseminate information to larger national and global audiences. It's a sort of role that Al Jazeera and Guardian can play. The networked social political uprisings also struggle quite frequently to last beyond the initial excitement of the event. Think of Occupy Sydney, what's happened to that? There's not a lot there anymore. So here we're talking about a sustainability issue, something that's really kind of often a struggle for many movements and network movements in particular.